Thank you so much. Thank you. So I come in peace to you today, and I have to mention or say 4 things before I start. First of all, thank you so much for Rowan for having me. It's wonderful to be here. It's my first time kind of encountering Joomla community so close, and I'm really, really impressed. So thank you so much for having me. Second thing is, I'm very impressed by the level of open source enthusiasm here in the room. That's been really impressive to me. I'm really, really happy to see this happening, and I really applaud your efforts in contributing to open source, so thank you for that. Third of all, I really care about diversity, so it's really cool to have so many platforms, so many people, so many everything in the world. So I do not want the dominance of Chrome, and I do not want the dominance of WordPress. I'm not saying it because I'm here, I'm saying it because it's really important. And the fourth thing that I also want to share, I really, really apologize to translators. The speed is going to be quite fast, and I don't know what I'm going to, how we're going to go for this, but we have altogether 388 slides to go through. So with this in mind, good luck, dear translators. I really do feel for you. But we will not cover everything, but we'll cover some parts of it. Now, my name is Vitaly. I was born in Belarus, moved to Germany. It was a long story. Right now, living in Lithuania, and co-founded this little site that some of you might know. If you could dim the lights, please, that would be perfect, actually. So this site is going to turn red very soon. And if you hate redness, which is perfectly acceptable and fine, it's going to be a white version as well, just in case you need it. And the reason why I'm showing this now is because many of the things that we learned along the way while rebuilding, redesigning, refactoring, recoding, restructuring, reinformation architecturing the site were really, really hard lessons that we learned along the way. And many of them are related to front end. And what I want to take you today is kind of on a journey of what is happening in front end. And specifically, in general, in responsive design as well. Now, how many of you, or who is a front end developer, mostly? Okay. Who is mostly not a front end developer? Because there are people who are front end and back end and things like that. So very often front end is something that you will have to be working on, of course. But the challenges that we have in front end today have become remarkable. It's really, really difficult to get through all of it. But we will try. Now, potentially we could cover 4 parts. But I want to focus on the front end side and back end side because I know that many of us are working in this space. But if you have questions about design later, we can definitely talk about it too. Now, front end. Now, specifically, when it comes to our side, we had a fundamental issue that we had to solve. Oops, sorry about that. And the problem was, of course, that many of you, like many other content publishers and magazines and blogging platforms and others, well, have an issue with ad blockers. Now, how many of you are using an ad blocker today? Okay, a vast majority. And don't get me wrong, I'm using an ad blocker as well. But it has a tremendous impact and has a tremendous influence on how we deliver content and what kind of content we're serving. So one problem that we encountered was, of course, advertising revenue, right? Year after year for the last 5 years, we've been having 50% revenue decline. And at this point, we have 66% of our users using an ad blocker, which is quite fundamental because if you think about it, we're earning today 1/16 of what we used to earn 5 years ago. So for me personally, advertising doesn't work anymore. And at this point, we actually had to move away, and many publishers have to move away from advertising to something a bit more stable. And for us, it was this product that we introduced, and I don't want to talk about it too much, but the point is we had to rebuild everything from scratch, which is why we had to learn so many lessons. We had to build a tool for the magazine, for articles, for comments, for e-commerce, for subscription service, for job board, for membership, and so on and so forth. And we had to do it from scratch, which was kind of an undertaking. And so we got to work, and first of all, of course, the first thing we did is looking at the browser stats. And this is what it was like for us. And it was very comfortable, so we could play with all kind of fancy technologies, right? Now, this is nice to have, but I really don't like the fact that we have this really disparity in diversity, right? This is like a thing that's really bothering me. And it has become even worse over the last few years. I mean, this is the statistics for us. It's not for you. But it's really kind of staggering to see it happening. At the same time, we also have to talk about the other ones, of course. And it was not really a problem for us because we had a little bit of IE here and there, but it was really a very comfortable environment so we could play with all kinds of technologies, right? That's not true, though, because we have one person one single person who is maybe even sitting in this room, who comes to the site with user agent, faked user agent being IE666. I kind of appreciate the joke, but it's interesting. It really skews my statistic by the end of the year, though. But one way or another, when we started working, we had to think really globally about how we're going to build things. Now, many of you might have seen something like this before. This is coming from similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it's kind of the same thing for developers building components. Now, many of you are working in a component world anyway, be it React or be it anything else at this point. But whenever we're building components, one of the things that kind of a framework, a mindset framework that I kind of apply to our work is we always start building, creating the leanest, fastest loading component first, then keeping it accessible, then scaling it up, responsive design, breakpoints, greets, and reordering, flexbox, and things like that. And eventually, at the very end, we'll have animations, transitions, transformations, fonts, and things like that. Which is interesting because even when we write CSS, and when we write JavaScript, we'll be following this pyramid of needs for development. This is going to become important in a second. Now, we always, these days, will be building websites, well, most of us, with components. Now, many of you might have heard of pattern libraries, design systems, style guides, something of that kind. How many of you are building one these days, or have one these days? Well, some of you. This is something that everybody is trying to to experiment with. And when we started building, and this was kind of one of the first mock-ups that we ended up with, very quickly we decided to be able to kind of move components around by setting up a pattern library. And this is what it looked like. It's kind of a living style guide, as we called it back then, and contains all the components, right, that we need, all listed, and potentially even with code snippets and things like that could be also added here. It's really, really great. But there is a problem and the problem was that it was actually very hard to maintain long term, and because it's supposed to be living, it's supposed to live in the code. So you're supposed to use some kind of living style guide tools in order to create documentation on the fly. It's really interesting to see many, many companies experimenting with this, and more specifically, Airbnb. And the example that Airbnb has provided is quite remarkable. Now imagine you're building a backend or even front end for your website, and what you end up doing is not just a website, but you're also kind of co-creating automatically some sort of a search engine for your interface screens. This is what Airbnb is doing, and they're actually open sourcing it as well, which is wonderful. So they call it airshots. The idea is you have tons of actually generated real-time previews of your interface, right? And you can type in as a designer or as a developer, whatever you need. If you need it for debugging, you might have different needs. You can write down what you need, what preview are you looking for, what languages are interesting for you, what components do you need, and here you go, you have a preview, right? That's pretty cool, because as a result, you have a really nice, beautiful environment to work in. Right, if you need to build a component called, I don't know, like overlay, you can actually get a preview of all overlays used throughout the entire site. That's pretty cool. But they took it to the next level, and I'm really excited about having this kind of coming up very soon. But Benjamin Watkins wrote, if machine learning algorithms can classify a complex set of thousands of handwritten symbols, such as handwritten Chinese characters, with a high degree of accuracy, then we should probably be able to classify the 150 components within our system as well, which takes it to another level altogether. Imagine, let me pause for a second, imagine that you have the components, your designer comes to you and says, so I drew a thing on the paper, here are my components, can you just build it? And you can say, sure, I'll let a machine do it for you. So you just scan the thing that they drew, here you go, here is your component, built in React already. It's already ready, you can prototype it, you can build on top of it, you can change it, and so on and so forth. That's quite remarkable to see this happening. And many companies are actually experimenting in this space. Now, not everybody will have something like this. You just scan, and voila, you have your React component, but it's pretty remarkable to see it happening, right? Now, for us, it was not really possible, and probably, it would take a certain level of experimentation to make it all work. But we ended up doing something quite similar. Well, not this kind of machine, but actually building the entire website on top of components, but not frameworks. So it was really hard for us in the beginning to decide what are we going to go with, right? Or what could we use? There are so many options. There is, we could use Angular, we could use React, we could use Preact, we could use tons of them, Vue, everything. And we thought maybe we don't have to, because this is how most of us, I feel when using frameworks. There are so many things we just don't know, and there are some things that we do know, but all these unknowns make the entire experience of coding, of debugging, quite unpredictable, which is why we tend to stick to small libraries, things that are more predictable, things that are kind of, that we can use and apply right away without being worried too much about what happens occasionally when you just add some CSS or JavaScript to it. I ran this poll a while back. Are you using jQuery in production these days? And it was really interesting to see that many people are also moving away from big UI libraries like jQuery, well, not necessarily UI library, kind of really moving away from it very quickly. All the things like Modernizer, people tend to move away from it because we don't really need it, right? Now, we did end up thinking about React first, but we ended up building the entire thing on top of Preact, which is like a 5 kilobyte subset of React, and it turned out to work really well. We might be moving to React after all these days, but mostly just because there are so many things that we had to build on our own, right? I will get to it in a second. Another thing we didn't want to have is media queries. And you might think, what the hell? What did media queries do now? What's wrong with the media query? Well, there is a fundamental maintenance problem with media query in responsive design. And the problem is, whenever you designers or you design something, you always design snapshots of the experience within this continuum of experiences we can have. So you might have a perfect mobile view, and you might have a perfect desktop view, or like large desktop view. And as a developer, what do we need to do? Well, we need to interpolate between these states, right? And that's very, very hard. This is why we need to introduce breakpoints to kind of, fill in this gap. So whatever website you have, you might end up with this scenario where at some point things just start breaking, right? Things like this start happening, right? Right here, for example, or maybe even here, but the navigation is all a little bit off, right? And you are wondering, okay, I need to add a breakpoint. And then you add more breakpoints. And the more perfectionist you are, the more breakpoints you add, ending up creating quite monolithic thing. Because in the end of the day, when you have a major change coming up in your layout, you will have to make this change kind of reflected all the way for all the breakpoints and all the media queries, which takes a lot of work. And I don't like too much work. So we thought maybe we could do different. And this is where the idea of fluid sizing come into play. Now, this is the layout that we built. And as you might have seen, might notice, we have this really prominent thing for the author, and many people hate it, and I think it's really important because they deserve more credit than they always get. But it was really kind of hard to actually build it, but especially building it in a responsive way. So here's an idea that we actually started with. Now, we want to build up a nice system built of components, right? This is kind of the goal. But if we wanted to make it really modular, wouldn't it be wonderful to say, my component, here's my component, I'm going to define a method or a function that describes the behavior of that component across different screens. And then if it gets smaller, it just fits itself, how it looks exactly as it's supposed to look. And if it's bigger, it just grows automatically. Kind of becoming a slight little thing. You add some, change the font size somewhere, and everything grows beautifully. You change it again, it grows again in another direction. More specifically, and this is where a bit of math is coming up, so if you wanted to describe this function, we don't want this unpredictable growth, right? If you think about heading, H1 for example, you don't want it to be like 2 pixels. You want it to start growing somewhere, and you want it to stop growing somewhere, right? Maybe between, 16 pixels and 24 pixels, but not between 1 and 130, right? So you're kind of looking for this, for your components. Still with me? Okay, right? So this is kind of what we want to achieve, right? Now, if we map, let's say, one component like heading, H1, on the map against the breakpoints and the viewport, or sorry, the font sizes and the viewport, we can find out that they're not linear. We don't have linear processes most of the time. So we might have 22 pixels at 600 pixels for the font size, 24 at 800, and 34 maybe at 1000, depending on what kind of typographic scale we use. So if we wanted to describe it, we need to describe this curve, right? Right? Yes. Now, if we wanted to describe it, we will need to do something like this. It's not possible to solve it with CSS. I tried desperately. It is not possible, okay? What we could do, though, is to try to approximate it, right? Now, I studied computer science and mathematics, so I really love this. Maybe a bit too much. But you could try that, right? Because the idea is actually quite interesting. So you could say, okay, let's break this thing into a couple of lines and approximate every single line, basically doing this, right? With y-intercept and the slope and some basic math here at play, basically doing this in CSS. Which is kind of possible. You could pull that off, right? In a way, right? But this is a lot of work and it's just like, what? I don't want to do this, right? This is just ridiculous. Because in the end, just to kind of illustrate what we want here, we want this, right? We want to beautifully start growing somewhere and beautifully automatically stop growing somewhere else, right? Without us having to do too much work, right? So there is a formula that describes, in a way, a similar behavior to the one that I described before, which is this one. I know it's very intuitive, but actually it's quite simple. Because if you think about it, I mean, in CSS we have calc. Calc allows us to run any kind of simple, basic arithmetic calculations. So things like if you describe your font size, and it doesn't have to be heading alone. It could be everything. It could be width, height, padding, border radius, everything. You describe it using this formula where you say, I have a minimum, right? Because whenever you add something to a value, it's going to be bigger because we don't have any negative values here. So you have a minimum. Let's say you have, again, a heading which grows from 16 pixels to 24 pixels, right? In a range between 400 pixels and 800 pixels, okay? And so what we're doing here is, so this is the minimum. This is the weight factor, how much the component is supposed to grow. This is the area which is left to grow over, which is 100 VW. 1 VW is 1% of the viewport width. And you divide it all through the entire area over which the component is supposed to grow. Okay? You don't have to understand it right now, but it's kind of the idea behind it. You just add some weight to the minimum that you have. Okay? And you end up with this, where you kind of have a growth from one size, one font size to another size without media queries at all. And it's right all the time. You don't have to plug in a media query to fix things, because it actually grows according to this formula, right? Now, just before you're wondering, calc, CSS, yes, it's well supported, except you know who, but we're used to it at this point, right? Now, think about it for a second. What if you applied this idea to every single thing in your layout, right? Maybe even line height. You don't want this kind of unpredictable growth in terms of line height. But for smaller screens, we need smaller line height. For larger screens, we need larger line height. It's exactly the same problem when we want to have maybe between kind of grow from 1.3 to 1.5 between 21 amps and 35 amps. You plug it in a formula that looks exactly like this. You end up with this without media queries, right? Just being right all the time. And now this comes the interesting part, because you can really extrapolate and use it everywhere, creating this kind of dynamic layouts that are created on the fly, right? The only thing that it means in front end is that you kind of need to play around a little bit with the fluid behavior that you have. Now, what if you set this fluid font size thing on the body, on HTML? Then the entire thing, your entire layout, every single component in your site is going to become fluid as well, right? And if you need a fixed one at some point, we just create a fixed container with a fixed font size, and everything inside is defined using M units. And you end up with this, right? Where this thing is becoming fixed, but everything else is kind of fluid and it grows automatically. Or the other way around, where you just create a fluid container, and in that container, everything is defined in M units, right? And then you end up with one component growing as you wish, right? So this is going to be this one, right? Now, here's the interesting part. We decided to give it a try and see if we can actually pull it off. And so every single thing that you see here is working this way. There are almost just a few media queries that define the responsive behavior, because, well, we need to change the order of components every now and again. But every single thing, the font size, the line height, the border of the image, the width of the image, the height of the image, the border of the SVG icon, the size of the SVG icon, the text font size in the menu button, the navigation icons and the way they roll, the shadow behind the navigation icons, every single thing is defined using calc, right? And it's all just grows naturally. It actually just keeps growing, and even if you have, let's say, 5,000 pixels or 8,000 pixels, it's just still going to look great, right? Now, at this point, it's really important to see what the viewing distance is, but you kind of get the idea here, right? So if you look at the code behind the scenes, there are many magic numbers And yeah, we simplified things every now and again a little bit, but it's all uses a combination of VW, which kind of ties it to the viewport, and calc, right? And I was really, really happy to actually see it working so well, right? That was interesting. Now, another thing that was kind of really important for us to figure out in the beginning, how we're going to write our CSS. Now, naming in CSS is the most ridiculous and the hardest thing. How many of you are using BAM or SMAX or anything of that kind? Okay. For those of you who are not, this is has become one of the major trends, if you like, because it really simplifies maintenance. Now, what is it? Now, the problem that we often have as developers, when you look at somebody else's code, be it CSS or JavaScript, I don't know what it does. I don't know where it's used. I don't know if I can delete it. I don't know if I can change it. I don't know if I can use it everywhere, anywhere. And I don't know anything. So the idea is simple. Why don't you prefix all the classes or all the JavaScript methods, whatever you're using, with prefixes, saying explicitly what you're actually operating on. Now, you might have things like O objects, so with the prefix O, basically standing for all structural objects, like a media object. Every single website has a media object, right? You could also have L for everything related to layout, right? You have C for everything that's component, like maybe an accordion, or a carousel, or a data list, or things like that, right? T for everything related to themes, like high contrast, low contrast, things like that. Everything that lives inside of a CMS that cannot be touched, right? It's like, for example, you want to scope whatever user your customer wants to type in the CMS, so to limit its impact on everything else, right? And then you might have states, like is open, has drop down, this kind of things, and utilities for things like clear fixes, float left, float right, and so on and so forth. So there are many, many things you can do, and actually we decided to actually give it a try as well. And even for hacks, things like _C, because later you can find them very easily, right? And that made coding so much simpler. It was just remarkable. You just start writing and you know exactly in what world you're in. You just need to decide early on what kind of component are you building right now, or what do you need right now. Is it like a heading? Okay, what kind of heading? And at the same point, one of the things that BAM or SMAX or other conventions actually provide is some sort of consistency in terms of relationship. Instead of just calling something very generic or very specific, you're trying to be somewhere in between, where you say, okay, this is a heading ribbon, but it's a large heading ribbon. So when you write CSS, you end up with lots of classes which all describe responsibilities for every particular utility, every particular class. So it have things like heading ribbon and then heading ribbon large, right? And you can reuse heading ribbon and sometimes actually enhance it with a large version explaining this relationship. And at this point, we're using BAM, and BAM stands for block element modifier, where you just say, okay, this is a heading ribbon, but it's a modified version of it, which is what -- stands for. And __ would stay for relationship, parent-son relationship. And it would look like this. A second, like this, right? So this is how we write CSS, or how we write, not CSS, HTML actually, with classes. And every single thing, every single class that we use is supposed to be reused. Every single thing, right? Because, we want reusability after all. So instead of having something very specific, maybe like giving it a very specific name, like a carousel for, previews or things like that, it's very generic, but at the same time, it's small enough so it can be reused. And another thing that we also tried is to use responsive suffixes, which is kind of an interesting idea, where you describe what the experience is like right in your HTML, right? So it's an image list component on small screens, and on large screens, it's becoming a carousel, right? And then in your CSS, the only thing you need to do is to escape the @ symbol. Otherwise, it's not going to work, right? And it's kind of interesting to see, like, just by looking at the code right now, I can see exactly what is happening, what each component is responsible for, and how I'm supposed to use it, which I think is pretty cool. And even better, you can use these prefixes in a slightly different way, where you can say, maybe everything that needs to be refactored or has been refactored can get a specific prefix as well. So then later, you can say, please highlight all the classes that have rf in them. Here you go. Or highlight all the classes that have not been refactored yet. Here we go, right? And that's quite cool. Now, another thing which is also interesting for us to explore is, of course, this new technology is coming in. Now, how many of you are familiar with Flexbox? Everybody. Who is familiar with CSS grid layout? Who is using CSS grid layout already today in production? Okay, some people, that's very cool. Now, grid is really, really incredible. Now, starting from March this year, grid has landed in all major browsers, and we can go ahead and actually use it today, creating even things like this if we want to. I mean, in the past, we needed, I don't know, a lot of time to build something like it. At this point right now, it's just a matter of maybe 5-6 minutes, and you're kind of done. So CSS grid layout is a very, very powerful thing. But when it's described, or when it's announced, or when it's explained, usually people tend to refer to this thing, which doesn't look particularly simple, if you ask me, right? So it looks like, oh, what does it mean, right? Now, let me give you a crash course in CSS grid layout in 3 minutes, okay? And just in case you're wondering, grid layout is really well supported these days, including you-know-who, which is fantastic, right? So there are a couple of things to know about grid. Now, there are grid lines, right? So we have a grid line. And we have a grid track, which basically is just the space between two grid lines. There's nothing fancy going on there. We have grid cells, and we have grid area. And when we define a grid layout, it's always done using grid template columns, and there are different ways of doing it. But you could say grid template columns, I need 4 columns with each 250 pixels, right? And so you have a grid which contains 4 columns. And you can position content against the grid lines, right? And you can also avoid this. You don't have to be so verbose. You could say, I want to repeat the pattern 4 times. So it's the same thing like in here. So repeat 250 pixels 4 times. It can also be like a bit more advanced. So you can say it's not fixed, because if it's 250 pixels, it's fixed layout. I don't want that. I want it to be fluid in a way. So very much like with Flexbox, where we have flex 1 or flex grow 1, or flex property, you can define a similar thing using fraction unit in CSS grid layout, where you can say 1 fraction unit is 1 item, 1 share of the available space. So here you're creating a layout which contains 5 times 1 fraction unit, 2 fraction units. 1 fraction unit, 2 fraction units, basically just distributing columns in a dynamic way, which is quite wonderful. And it can also be anything. You can also combine it and do other things. And you can do the same thing for rows as well, right? So let me give you an example just to make it very clear what you can do with it. Now, here's a problem that we ran into. Now, some of you might have seen this before. You have a content area, and then you have an area like a block or image or something that has to break out, right? So it has to go full width. So how do we make it work? Now, there are a couple of things. If you want to actually make it a bit more general, this is kind of a view, right? You have this content container, and then you have an image that has to break out. Could be advertising or anything else. So you could say, okay, I have my little div here, and I have a content pros, right? And, I have important things in my life to do, right? So I'm just going to close the container, put an image inside, and reopen it again, right? Please don't do that, right? That's like, it's so, after this, people go home and drink. Don't do that. That's not, we don't want that. We want it to be better. So there are different ways. Now, one of them is to say, we need to just calculate how much space we need to push the image to the left and to the right, right? How can we do it? Again, we can use calc here. We just need to think about how to what to calculate. So again, if we look into this container, now we need to push this image on the right and this one on the left. So we need to calculate this space to push it to the left and this space to push it to the right, right? So what is it? Now we have the container, right? If we take 50% of that container, right, and remove from it this part, we end up with this, which is actually similar to this. No? Yes? Maybe? So it's like we have a 50% of the container, and then we have 50% of the entire screen. If we remove 50% of the container from 50% of the entire screen, we end up with this part, and we push it to the right, and we push it to the left. Right? Okay, trust me, that's right. Yeah. I tried, right? So you ended up like writing exactly this. So you have 50% of the entire viewport and plus 50% of the, well, minus 50% of the entire viewport width because it's usually bigger, of course, than the container, plus 50% of the container, and then you're kind of done. Yes, but that really will bring you a little problem, which is this one, because whenever you're talking about this viewport units, VW and VH, they always do not include a scroll bar, which is kind of a problem. So you could say, okay, I'm going to do this and and just go home and sleep and drink. Don't do that. That's not what we actually want to do. So here's how we can actually easily solve it with grid layout. Now, this is exactly the same problem. We can frame it differently. Now, the first thing we do is say, well, do you support grid? Well, we can also use add support, so we don't need modernizer anymore at this point. We can just use add supports, which is like modernizer. The problem with add supports is that it's not supported by browsers who desperately need support for it. Right? So, IE11 doesn't support it, so it's like, so what's the point, right? But for the future, we're definitely going to work for all upcoming technologies. So do it support grid? If you do, let's make this container a grid container. And I'm going to define a couple of columns here. 1, 2, 3, right? I have 1, and I can have this min-max function, which allows it to grow automatically from 1m to 1 fraction unit. So I'm growing from being 1m to kind of being a bit bigger according to how many shares there are to distribute across the screen. And then you have another min-max going from 0 to 40m, so at most 40m's. This one can become very, very small. You might want to change it at some point. And then here it's, again, acting as a gutter, very much like this one. Now, the important thing is if you have 3 columns, you have 4 grid lines. So you have 3 columns, 1, 2, 3, and you have 1, 2, 3, 4 grid lines. Now, in grid layout, you always position content against grid lines, right? So what does it mean? Now, with these brackets, you can give names to grid lines. So you could say, I have my first line that's going to be called full start, the second one main start, third main end, and the fourth full end, right? And so you give them names. I mean, this is really ridiculously simple at this point. And you put content against these lines. Basically just writing, okay, if grid is supported, I want the entire container, everything inside of it, flow into main area, which is going to be this one, right? And everything else, like this image that I want to break out, it's going to go into full, which is starting here and ending here, right? And you're done. It's really, really quite remarkable how you can do it. And even better, the best thing about grid is that you cannot do just this. Because we don't use media queries, and because we don't rely on the viewport width here, you can also put it inside of another container, or inside of another component, and it's just going to do exactly what it needs. So if you have something like a sidebar, it's still going to work. It would not work with media queries. It would not work with viewport width units, right? But it does work in here, which is very, very cool. And you can even create things like this very simply, because you can combine Flexbox properties we know from alignment, like justify content and align items, with grid as well. They're kind of sharing this specification, right? Now, one more thing I want to show, and I have so many things. How much time do I have? No time. Okay. Well, there are many, many things that are really, really interesting and important, but I want to leave you with one that I think is really, really fundamental of what we all are doing. And this is where I think one of the main advantages, or not advantages, are like opportunities for Joomla is as well. Now, from the backend side of things, we moved from WordPress or from LAMP stack to Gem stack, kind of basically becoming serverless. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not just a very simple set of static pages. We have membership, we have authentication, we have shopping platform, we have subscription, we have a lot of moving parts around the way. But we actually managed to pull it off. But the first thing we wanted to do is not to move away from WordPress because we hate it. I really like WordPress. The reason is it was really impossible to build that central product that we were building, the membership, and tie it in with everything else. Now, we used to use Ruby on Rails for our job board. We used to use Magento. Then we actually moved to Shopify. It was a long story, migration and everything. It was like a long story. And then for magazine, we actually were using WordPress for a while. Well, from day one, actually, right? But it was really difficult to create that product because you would need to be able to be signed in once and get discounts for all of these products at once, right? You didn't want to have, let's say, 4 or 5 different accounts on different platforms. So we thought maybe we can give a try to something new. And many of you might have seen this growth of static site generators at this point, Hugo, Jekyll, and others. And it all has been this rise of the gem stack, JavaScript APIs and markup. And it boils down to the practices we are using today when we're working. Now, how many of you are still using FTP for deployment? That's okay, it's a safe place. Okay? So FTP has become kind of really outdated, no, not outdated, but it's kind of slowly dying, while GitHub and Git and everything related is really on the rise. And if we look into the build process, I mean, many of you will be using Gulp or Grunt or anything of that kind, right? Any build processes, right? So it was all just not here, let's say 6 or 7 years ago, and it's been growing ever since, right? At the same time, we have all these APIs. If you need to have a payment API, you can get it. If you need Stripe for wrap around your payments, you get it. Intercom and for comments and for Discuss and others. So I thought, okay, in the past we used to have this, right? We have a browser and a server, and then a server would communicate to the browser, and you're kind of done. But then somebody said, no, that's not good enough. We need to have a program. So we can have some interactive clock and things like this. And say, okay, so we can do that now. And then I said, well, we need a database now. We need to provide a proper database and database design and everything. I said, okay, so we're going to have LAMP stack and PHP and MySQL, and we're going to call it a day. But then somebody said, no. We need to care about performance, so we're going to add some caching. And you said, okay, so we need to do some caching. So we need to have a little bit more communication going on. That's cool. And then somebody said, no, that's not good enough because we need to have a CDN, right? So it has become a bit more complicated. And then it really blew it up, right? Because you have to care about so many different things. And we thought maybe we don't need it anymore. So what if there was only a browser and only a CDN and nothing in between, right? So you just serve content straight from the CDN and you enrich whatever you have there with sophisticated JavaScript. Why would you do that? Performance. Now the performance results we're noticing are just remarkable. And I will get to them in a second. But the idea is very simple. Every single article, every single comment, every single blog post, every single job posting, every single thing is a markdown file. We have a build process in place, which kind of creates this, generates HTML and generates CSS on top of it, like the critical CSS or above the fold CSS for performance. We push it straight to CDN, and then we enrich it with some custom API that we built on top of it, right? So every time we need to make a change, we don't use a database at all. We just go through the build process and straight to a CDN, and we then invested in having a really good CDN. I'm almost finished, I promise, right? And yes, we kind of built a single-page application because we were using React, but the reality is that we did not want to have one single point of failure and also like a really slow loading process. So we ended up creating a suite or set or bundle of single-page applications. So we have many, many microservices, like many companies do, of course. And it turned out to be working really, really well. And I'm really happy that all of the stuff that we're building and all the APIs that we're building are also now open sourced. And we built this open source ecosystem together with Netlify that you can go ahead and use for membership, for e-commerce, for blogging, for everything, right? And yes, again, not using React, but using Preact instead, right? And the results that we're using and the strategies we're using are kind of interesting. So if you have, let's say, of course, for live search and things like that, you need to have some sort of an API. And if you don't have JavaScript at all, or you're very slow, well, then the fallback in our case is just Google search. It still works, right? We use service workers a lot, and this is something that probably should be a default these days when we're building a website anyway, right? Because every time I have this conversation, we don't have the offline use case. We don't have an offline problem. Well, nobody wakes up in the morning hoping to access your website offline. That's true. But there is no way any online delivery of assets, of CSS, of JavaScript can be faster than offline. Offline is just much, much, much faster, right? And just by moving to the static site generated thing, we ended up becoming 6 times faster and starting rendering sometimes even under 0.5 seconds. And again, it's a single-page application. It's not like a set of static pages that do nothing. We don't have any critical requests at all. Whenever you come to the page, you don't even need JavaScript to start render at all, right? And you don't even need CSS requests to start render either, because we use critical CSS for it, right? Now, that's been a long journey, and if you want to play with it, it's actually now available in open beta. Just go on next-magazine.com and give it a try. But I just wanted to share a couple of things that were really important to us. And I want to wrap up by just showing you a little story of my life for the last 1.5 years of building it. I'm really happy that it's actually almost over, and we're going to release probably next week. But it's been a story with a lot of unhappy endings, so I want to leave you with this. This is the story of my life, last 18 months. Can we make it a bit louder? It doesn't matter what you do in your CSS or JavaScript, it's just never right. That's just sad. But that's okay, I have cats. Now the true story is we have 68 cats scattered all over the interface at this point. There are good reasons for it. I'm not a cat person, and I truly believe that if I look at you now, that you're not cat people, right? According to my scientific survey, there are 40% of people are dog people, 30% are cat people, everybody else just doesn't care at all. Now it's too late for us, it's not too late for you. So this in mind, thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for having me here. And meow.